Thank you so much, Tina. And I actually walked in on their little volunteer grouping here, and they actually had to decide what type of plants that they were before they put their hands in. So that was really lovely to see. And thank you so much for the Creative Mornings team, because you do this all as volunteers to gather this community, and that is just so awesome. And also thank you to everyone who showed up and who was able to get a ticket. I heard that there was still 300 people who still wanted to be on the wait list. So you guys made it here. That's awesome to get a little bit of inspiration before you head off to work or wherever else that you're going to be heading, and to talk about the theme of roots, which is so fun, because when we think of the word roots, a lot of other words can come to mind. So words like immobile or unmoving or grounded, or maybe even something that's culturally oriented. So some of us, if you are like me, immediately think of plants. And it's funny because when you think of the word long enough, as I have before coming up here on stage, it's really layered in a lot of meaning. So if we focus in on some of those words that I earlier mentioned, like anchored and grounded, it could actually make some of us feel a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe give us a little bit of anxiety, because it sometimes feels at odds with living life in the city, especially New York City, because it is one of the most mobile, ever-changing, frenetic environments in the world. And quite frankly, we end up pushing that energy off onto other parts of the world as well. So let's just have a show of hands out of curiosity. How many of us have switched jobs, let's say in the last 3 years? Okay, all right, you guys are not alone, clearly, if you look around the room. How many of us have moved at least once in the last 3 years? Okay, about the same amount of people. I'm seeing maybe 60 or 70%. How many of us have switched partners in the last 3 years? Yeah, okay, not as many there. Okay, fine. Now, how many of us done all three? We switched our jobs, we said sayonara to our partner, and we moved into an apartment whose rent is inversely proportional to the square footage. Okay, all right, about 30% of you guys. And how many of us, and I'm sure there are some of us here because Tina was exemplifying this, how many of us feel as if we are in our forever home with our forever partner in our forever job? Okay, hands dropped, a select chosen few. If you're afraid because you're sitting next to your partner, I understand. But this point is to be made is that this is why it's really difficult to actually talk about roots or rootedness or being rooted or growing roots or feeling like you're rooted, when so much of our world is in this constant state of flux. And that's what we're actually going to be talking about in the next 20 minutes. And within that 20 minutes, I hope to actually give you some guidance, maybe some words of wisdom, and just establish how we could have roots in this ever-changing environment. But in true form, I'm going to do that through the story of plants, because as Tina had mentioned, I am a plant person, or I've been described by others as a plant person. But back to the questions that I asked earlier, because I don't want you all to be the only guinea pigs. So if I actually raised my hands, I actually have been living in Brooklyn now, in the same place, for about 15 years. So I've been in that same community with a lot of the same people, even though my community has changed quite dramatically. I've been with the same partner for a little bit of time, and even though I'm a creative in the gig economy, which I think many of us sitting here know how that can be, I've pretty much been doing the same thing that I've been doing for the last 3 years, but it wasn't always that way. And also, if you asked me if I was in my forever home, I mean, that is where my hand would actually drop. But even though I didn't always have that, and I don't have that with my own home, I really do have this deep sense of rootedness to myself, to a lot of the people that I have around me, and also to my greater community. So something really unexpectedly wonderful happened about 4 years ago now. And a photographer from Modern Farmer magazine, whom I had met at a food book party, asked to come by my home to photograph my worm bin because, like every other New Yorker, I have a worm bin under my sink for fast and efficient composting, and I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands because I know all of you also have a worm bin under your sink. So Eliza, the photographer, she was really expecting to see the garden that my worms were building, and this is an example of the garden at its finest, if you're curious as to what it looks like. But what she didn't expect to see was my garden. And this is one of the snaps that she actually ended up taking that day. Now, she was pretty astonished about the plants that I had growing in my home, and she asked if anybody had ever come to photograph or write a story on my place, and I said, well, they did. I've been growing plants for now 11 years in my Brooklyn apartment, and people wrote stories, but it never really seemed to be like a big deal. But for whatever reason, she felt like at the time that it would make a really good story. And I told her, well, that's fine, feel free to photograph away and take pictures of my plants. And what I didn't expect was when the article ran, and I think it was like now in April of 2016 or so, I didn't expect it for it to go viral. And what I mean by viral is that within a short period of time, probably about like 3 months, over 50 million people had seen my home. And it wasn't from like just this. It was like a number of other articles who actually sniffed out the story and they did their own versions of the Modern Farmer article. But before I knew it, I had these queries from like Philadelphia to the Philippines, and they were asking me about plant care advice, how I water my plants, what plants are my favorite, if I could identify their plants, what's wrong with theirs, if I was single, because clearly a woman living with hundreds of houseplants is single, to the point that it was like really awesome, like the eye of a hurricane is really awesome, but it's also like really overwhelming. So for probably 9 to 10 months, I actually didn't really know what to do because I was like doing other things and not being able to answer people's questions, but I eventually leaned into it. And I decided to buy the latest iPhone, which I still have, which is not the latest anymore, because it shot 4K videos, and I just sat at my kitchen table answering people's questions about plants, and I put it up on a YouTube channel called Plant One On Me. And this was to really help with the efficiency of answering questions, because if somebody said, well, how do you water your plants? I said, well, episode 16. Okay, well, cool. Then what are your best grow light options? Well, episodes 52 to 54. So it actually gave an opportunity to be able to help people and answer their questions with just being one person. And that was really lovely. But as I was kind of developing this, and this is like the channel, it's called Plant One On Me. As I was actually developing this, I wanted to really get people deeper into plants, so go beyond that superficial kind of level. And the way I thought I could do that is by hitting a little bit of an emotive chord, telling a human story, because we have to get past the superficial level of it in order to deepen our love and engagement with anything in life. And so the mission of the channel really has become to bring people closer to plants by bringing plants closer to them through education, through human stories, and through entertainment. So since I have you all here, I'm just out of curiosity, how many people have watched Plant One On Me or know of it on YouTube? Oh my God, there's so many people not raising their hands. This is so great because there's so many other plant people to convert. And more subscribers, because YouTubers are always looking for subscribers. So the channel goes through many different verticals. We have like plant tips, DIY, houseplant home makeovers, outbounds. We actually go in the wild to see where plants are from. And I'm just going to play a little 60-second snippet of an episode that will launch, I don't know if it's next month or the month following, just to give you an idea of what the channel features if you're unfamiliar with this. And this is an example of a houseplant home tour where we literally go into somebody's home and look at their plants. So here it is. I know a lot of plant people want to know what it's like to actually live in a greenhouse. And last year I came to Culemborg. There's like music going on. I don't know what that music is.
Everything's great.
Yeah, the Spotify just decided to come on.
Everything's great.
Okay, perfect. All right, here we go. One more time. I know a lot of plant people want to know what it's like to actually live in a greenhouse. And last year I came to Culemborg in the Netherlands, and I came upon this community. And what's interesting is that some of these houses are actually built in greenhouses. So it's not true greenhouse conditions, but I thought, man, it would be really cool to actually meet somebody here who's growing plants and to find out what it's like to live in a pseudo greenhouse. That's it. Yeah, so this is a lot of fun, being able to really touch people's lives and go into people's homes and share a little bit of their story is just something so marvelous about it. And plus that guy had like 6 of the largest cats I've ever seen. So it's fun. We have a lot of cat time and we have a lot of plant time. So that will be launching next month, but the channel's really filled with stories like that. So through all of this, it really got me thinking about, okay, this girl with hundreds of houseplants, why did it really resonate with people at that point in time anyway? To the point that I really took the time out to begin to speak with people and meet with people and ponder it and then put it into a book that I just came out with called How to Make a Plant Love You, Cultivate Green Space in Your Home and Heart. And it's interesting because this book is put into the gardening section of bookstores, but actually this book is only peripherally about the topic of gardening. And what the book is really about is about relationships. And yes, our relationships to plants, but also our relationships to ourselves, the people around us, and to the greater community, and about how we can actually nurture that relationships to the people around us. And the subtitle, Cultivate Green Space in Your Home and Heart, that is really filled with a lot of juicy double entendres. Yes on cultivate, yes on home, but what I really want you to focus on is the word space, because space is not totally meant to be a thing like our physical space, like an office space or our home space, but also our mental and our spiritual space for that which is really important in life. So in yoga and meditation, when we talk about creating space, it is understood in that context. And this is just one of the many layers that I wanted the book to have. And growing anything well, whether that be plants or a relationship or a skill set, that takes time. It takes patience, observation, discipline, dedication. And that really got me thinking beyond this like superficial layer of plants as decor, which really populates kind of the current psyche right now. And also just because I don't really look at my plants as just decor items. I mean, it's true that they make a room really beautiful, but there is a differentiation there, and there is an ability there to actually go deeper. So it got me thinking about what is it that we really need as people? What is it that we are really looking for when we are curious enough to click on an article of a woman surrounded by her plants? So while we think about that for ourselves, it's here where I'm going to be switching gears and talk more about plants. And this is where you'll see me get a little bit more animated. But we're going to explore what roots mean to plants. And in order to do that, I want to really step back in time to help contextualize plants in relation to our lives. But in order to do that, I really want to pull from one of my favorite authors and a favorite quote of his. He has out-of-print books now, but his name is Guy Murchie, and that is this quote. Let us twine our toes into roots, surge with the sap, and hearken to the great trees. For theirs is a life that is older than animalness, deeper than thought, and that may very well penetrate the primordial genesis of us all. So, since we're all here, this is halfway through the speech, let's give one collective breath in. That's oxygen, and that's a gift. So, imagine 1 million Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs being dropped on Earth. This is the radiant energy equivalent to the sun's rays that reaches the Earth every single day. And photosynthesis, this is the mighty power of using the sun's energy to split those water molecules into its component parts of hydrogen and oxygen. And it captures only 1% of this. And that sun harnessing and that water splitting fuels some bacteria, algae, and nearly all plants on Earth. And that takes up 2 million tons of CO2 and involves some 300 billion tons of sugar in vegetation every year. And that is the most massive chemical process on Earth. Now, you multiply this by how long photosynthesis has been happening on this planet, and that is estimated somewhere between 3.5 billion and 2.8 billion years. So now you have this leviathan, if not godly act of existence. But plants didn't exist at first. Instead, you had these special bacteria called cyanobacteria, and they began using that CO2 as food and then released oxygen into our atmosphere. Then at about 2.3 billion years ago, this great oxygenation event happened. And that is when these guys moved in, and these cute little guys are called chloroplasts, and those are the organelles that help plants photosynthesize. And that likely developed from this protist coming along and eating up one of those cyanobacterium that I had mentioned earlier, but instead of eating it completely and digesting it, they just engulfed it. This likely led to the first algae at about 1.6 billion years ago now. And that floated on these mats of the ocean wave, and eventually they kind of reached to shore. And they said, uh-oh, how on earth, every pun intended, are we going to survive on this brown crust? Now, that is where fungi comes in. Now, you might not recognize this because this is not the fruiting body of a fungus, but this is mycelium, which is more like the roots. But these are vitally important to almost every plant's existence here on Earth and the stability of the Earth itself. And the first symbiosis actually took place on land between an algae and a fungus, probably somewhere between 600 and 500 million years ago. And who remembers from Bio 101 days when an algae and a fungus get married? What is that? Lichen, yes! Someone remembers! Congratulations! Yes, lichen, after a fungi with the algae. Okay, so then you get the liverworts, you get hornworts, they get mosses, they don't get a slide here. And then oxygen was really being further produced. And then we get to my favorite time in history, which is the Devonian period. And this is when the first seed-forming plants actually appeared, and plant groups were popping up left and right like the next Instagram influencer, and it was called the Devonian explosion. And it made my home state of Pennsylvania look like the Florida Everglades, except with way more ancient plants. And that brown crust that I mentioned earlier, well, it was turning green. And that's how God's green earth was developed. But I think it just sounds better than God's brown crusty earth. But the crazy thing is, at the time, the CO2 in the atmosphere was 2,200 parts per million. Now that made our current 408 parts per million look like a pittance, but that carbon was actually fuel for plants. And if we weren't cutting down 15 billion trees a year, which is almost half of the trees over the last 12,000 years, then we might just actually have an opportunity to suck up some of the excess carbon that's going into the atmosphere, because that is exactly what happened and what was happening during the Devonian period. And plants were sucking up that CO2 and pumping out more oxygen quite happily. But how on God's green earth, pray tell, were the plants expanding onto that brown crust? Because they weren't just in the nice parts near the water. No, they began to actually populate every terrain imaginable, and they were some of the first pioneers. So they managed to persevere in salt flats and marshy lands, often devoid of any type of oxygen or nutrients. They clawed and anchored their way up rock faces and cliffs, and they hung there, hanging like daredevils from those cracks and crevices. And they even climbed to the tops of trees, escaping all that competition below, and they affixed themselves up there. And they even persevered in the driest of deserts and the darkest depths of the forest floor. They have been growing and adapting to their ever-changing environments for the past 400 plus million years. So perhaps it could actually be a useful exercise to ask what we could actually learn from these guys and how they have used their roots to navigate their ever-changing, harsh environment. Because even though I said those words in the beginning called anchored, immobile, unmoving, a plant's roots are anything but immobile. They are actually constantly out there. They're reading, they're searching, they're moving, and they're even changing their environments. In fact, it's no mistake that the neuron networks of our brains look and fire much in the same way that fibrous roots of plants look and fire. And if I showed you this, these are neurons, but if I told you that these were plant roots, you'd probably believe me too. And it's just no mistake that the roots of plants are also known as the brains of plants, and they are so vital. When you cut a plant's stem behind the node, the plant doesn't waste time putting out another leaf. It actually will put out a root. And if you slice the base of a succulent behind the stem, right on the meristem, which is the growing area, the plant will also start to root. And plants use their roots for support and nourishment, and they do this through relationships. And they do this through relationships not only to itself, but also relationships to others of its kind and others not of its kind. So that's like fungi, bacteria, archaea, protozoa, nematodes, soil, air, water, earth, stone, and everything else around it. So roots are patrolling their dark environs, which are just full of life. And every minute of every day, they are breathing, they are brokering deals with fungi, they are like fighting off bad bacteria, they're allowing other bacteria to like propagate on their roots. There are more things happening beneath our feet in the soils than a daytime soap opera, and it's a hell of a lot more interesting, and it's a lot less predictable. Now, late in response, but very good. Now, sometimes those relationships are definitely more one-sided, and you'll always have those. But more often than not, it is this complex society or this community working together. Now, I use this example in my book, and I love it, so I'm actually going to use it here. But forest roots at night will actually pull up water from the depths of the soil and suck it up to the top so that other plant roots could actually have that water. This is called hydraulic lift. Now, this actually helps to maintain the integrity of the forest. And we look at ecosystems sometimes as if plants are just spontaneously placed in that ecosystem, and that ecosystem was always that ecosystem. No, it started off as a brown fucking crust. Just as if like when we are in New York City and we just get dropped here or wherever we're actually from, and we shrug and we say, okay, this is the environment that I have, so I accept it and I ain't gonna do anything about it. Meh. No, plants, if they are not mowed over or plucked or carelessly removed from their environments, create the ecosystems that they want to live in. The Amazonian rainforest, which is often called the lungs of the earth, and this is just a great example of this. So what I want you to focus on, this is actual cloud cover over the course of a few months. And what I really want you to focus on is you could see the green areas. Yes, the green belt of Africa, and you could also see the green belt of South America, just right here where the Amazonian forest is. And just notice the clouds kind of forming over those forests. How can you look at this and not think that the earth is not inhaling and exhaling like a complex organism? So what's happening here? The forest is releasing water into that air through evapotranspiration, and it forms clouds there, and the water falls back down to earth as rainfall. And that is in order to maintain the appropriate climatic conditions for that forest that it's creating itself. That's what the water cycle is, people. And if we actually had our teachers teach about this in relation to our lives, maybe this would have been something more interesting to us, and we would have been interested in more relational science and what our place in this world actually means. So what's interesting about this is the water is coming off the ocean. It drops onto the forest along the coastal line. Then it drops onto the next forest. It evapotranspires and drops into the next forest. So it's like creating this little water cycle. But then you remove a forest. You burn a forest, like is what is happening. And all of a sudden you have this bald spot. Well, what happens? But that water cycle is now broken. And what are we getting? We are getting droughts, not just in that forest, but droughts as far away as Australia and California. So plants use their support and their roots for support and nourishment. And they really do this through a complex array of relationships. And they have taken their time, a very, very long time, to build that whole community around them. So is it any wonder why, when you take out a forest, and that fertility of that soil is just removed in 3 to 4 short years' time? Because that lifeblood of that soil has been removed. And you've destroyed a very complex relationship and society underneath that soil. In our own communities, in our own workplaces, when we create those bald spots or those inequities, those pockets of really bad energy or of malice, of jealousy, when we really tear through relationships in our lives, or if we destroy whole countries and cause millions of people to disperse across the world as refugees, then we lose that support and the nourishment for us as well. So let's take a lesson from our plants. Because roots don't necessarily mean immobility in a relatively boring or static environment. No, it means constantly searching meaning in the darkness of an ever-changing world and living a fulfilling life by finding support and nourishment, by forming long-term, meaningful bonds and relationships with everything around us to create the world that we want to live and thrive in. Thank you.